December 17, 1944, 5:30 hours. The forests around Honsfeld, Belgium were still wrapped in pre-dawn fog when the lead Tiger tank of SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's column gave a choking cough and fell silent. The Maybach engine refused to turn over. Peiper slammed his gloved fist on the turret, the metallic thud echoing through the frozen air. His driver shouted up from below, "Fuel's gone. Even the reserve." Peiper climbed down, boots crunching against the icy ground. All around him, one of the most formidable armored spearheads of the German army, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and 5,000 Waffen-SS veterans, stood powerless, their engines dead in the cold. Through the haze, Peiper spotted what looked like salvation, the abandoned American depot of Honsfeld, left behind by the retreating U.S. 99th Infantry Division. Campfires still smoldered, mugs of coffee sat half full, and in neat military rows stretched hundreds of olive-drab jerry cans. Peiper's adjutant pried one open, sniffing the contents. "Gasoline," he said. "Not just any high-octane Allied fuel." The men erupted into action, hauling cans toward their vehicles. Peiper watched silently, calculating what it meant. 50,000 gallons, enough to reach the Meuse River. Enough, perhaps, to change the war. But as the first engines roared back to life, a grim truth settled over Peiper. If the Americans could abandon this much fuel and not blink, the balance of the war was already decided. Germany's tanks were driven by hope more than fuel. America's war machine ran on oceans of petroleum. The realization pierced deeper than the frost. They weren't fighting equals anymore. They were fighting an industrial giant. 6 months earlier, Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer had delivered a devastating report. Allied bombers had shattered Germany's synthetic fuel network. Plants at Luna, Blechhammer, and Brucks were producing less than 10% of capacity. April 1944 had yielded 175,000 tons. By September, barely 5,000. The figures screamed defeat, but Hitler refused to hear them. Germany's tanks and aircraft were running on fumes, while America produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil that same year, 50 times the Reich's total output. As Peiper's column refueled under the ghostly Belgian dawn, he didn't yet know his discovery at Honsfeld was no triumph. It was revelation. The jerry cans that revived his tanks also exposed a truth Germany could never overcome. December 16, 1944, one day earlier. The German barrage that launched Operation Wacht am Rhein thundered across the Ardennes. It was the largest artillery bombardment since the Eastern Front, but unlike the past, the shells masked scarcity. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the tip of the 6th SS Panzer Army's spear, was already short on fuel before even moving. His tanks idled for hours as supply trucks lagged behind. Engines turned off every 5 minutes to conserve fuel. The attack that was meant to slice the Allied line was already bleeding energy before it began. On paper, Peiper's column had enough fuel for 50 miles. The Meuse River, their ultimate objective, was 65 miles away. The math guaranteed failure, but the orders were clear. Capture American depots or die trying. Hitler's generals gambled the offensive on enemy supplies. Peiper knew that fuel was now more decisive than bullets. Without it, even the most powerful tanks became frozen monuments. He told his officers, "Fuel first, everything else second." Meanwhile, the Americans fought a different war. Just 20 miles west, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion recorded in his diary, "Received third fuel delivery this week, storage tanks full." Where Germans calculated in liters, Americans measured in oceans. Their front lines were supplied by the Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks delivering 12,000 tons of material every day. Fuel depots stretched like arteries across liberated France, pumping life into an army that never stopped moving. By dawn on the 17th, Peiper's tanks had covered barely 20 miles, half of them on fumes. When they finally stormed into Honsfeld and found the abandoned depot, the jubilation was almost spiritual. 50,000 gallons seemed divine. But beneath that euphoria lay a fatal misunderstanding. The Americans could abandon what Germany would guard with entire divisions. That captured fuel wasn't victory. It was evidence of imbalance. As Peiper's engines growled back to life and the column pushed onward, a new battle began. Not against Allied soldiers, but against the ticking clock of empty fuel gauges. By noon on December 17th, Peiper's armored column rolled toward Bullingen, engines now humming with captured American gasoline. The road was littered with burnt-out vehicles and frozen soldiers, both friend and foe. Every mile consumed gallons that could not be replaced. His officers calculated grimly. At this rate, they would run dry before reaching the halfway mark to the Meuse River. But then came news of another American fuel depot, one far larger, located at Stavelot. 2 million gallons. Salvation if they could reach it in time. As Peiper's men advanced, they stumbled upon something that would stain their names in history, the Malmedy Massacre. 84 American prisoners were executed in a field outside the town. Peiper later claimed it was necessity, no fuel to transport captives. The act was a symptom of the same desperation choking the offensive. Every drop of gasoline dictated life or death. German efficiency had turned into starvation, measured not in rations but in liters. At Stavelot, however, the Americans were ready. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received word that the German column was approaching. His orders were clear and merciless. Deny fuel to the enemy, at any cost. The depot contained over 2 million gallons of gasoline in neatly stacked jerry cans spread across 15 acres. Brewster's engineers began pouring trails of fuel between the rows, preparing for the unthinkable. At 16:30 hours, Sergeant Paul Solis hurled a white phosphorus grenade into the nearest stack. The explosion roared like thunder, igniting the entire depot in seconds. A wall of fire erupted over the Belgian countryside, flames rising nearly 100 feet. By the time Peiper's lead tanks appeared, the inferno was unstoppable, a black tower of smoke stabbing into the winter sky. The fuel that could have carried him to Antwerp was now ash. Peiper climbed onto his tank, staring into the flames. For 5 silent minutes, no one spoke. Finally, he muttered, "They can afford to burn what we would die to possess." Across the Ardennes, other American units began destroying their depots too. Millions of gallons turned into fire to starve the German advance. By December 19, 1944, Peiper's once mighty column was running on vapors. His advance through Stoumont and Trois-Ponts slowed to a crawl as fuel gauges neared zero. Tanks were being abandoned in ditches, not from battle damage but starvation. Each mile forward demanded gallons they no longer had. His maintenance officer, Hauptmann Otto Dingler, wrote bitterly in his log, "We have consumed 67,000 gallons, captured 55,000. The deficit grows. Even victory smells of exhaustion." The Allies, reading German radio intercepts, understood the situation perfectly. General Courtney Hodges issued new orders. Enemy short of fuel. Destroy all stocks at risk of capture. American engineers set depots aflame across Belgium. At Spa, Trois-Ponts, and Sauerbrot, over 8 million gallons of gasoline went up in smoke within days. More than Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. To the Allies, fuel was expendable. To the Germans, it was life itself. Even as the flames devoured their hopes, Peiper's men pressed on. Near La Gleize, they captured another small depot, barely 5,000 gallons, consumed within hours. The Tigers guzzled fuel faster than it could be found, 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile. In the frozen terrain, consumption rose by 40%. "We drove tanks like they were dying animals," one mechanic recalled. Every roar of the engine sounded like the last. By December 21st, Peiper's group was trapped in La Gleize, surrounded by U.S. forces from the 30th Infantry, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored Division. The Americans had a daily fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 left. Private Richard McKinney of the 30th Division wrote home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." That night, Peiper gathered his officers. There would be no retreat by road, only by foot. He gave the order to destroy every vehicle that could not move. Flames rose once more, this time from German hands. The elite armor of the Reich burned quietly under falling snow. December 23, 1944. The weather cleared over the Ardennes, and with the skies came destruction. Allied aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-26 Marauders, and C-47 transports, filled the heavens. Each sortie consumed more fuel than Peiper's entire armored group possessed. The Luftwaffe could barely fly. Germany's refineries were dust and rubble. By that day's end, Allied planes had burned millions of gallons in a single operation. Fuel that Germany couldn't refine in a month. Peiper's tanks, by contrast, stood motionless, their crews shivering beside them like stranded statues of iron. That night, Peiper ordered the impossible. Abandon all vehicles and escape on foot. 39 Tigers and Panthers, masterpieces of German engineering, were blown apart with grenades to keep them from capture. Snow fell as the last engines died. Out of nearly 5,000 men who began the offensive under his command, fewer than 800 would return. The fields around La Gleize became a graveyard of machines, each one a symbol of a nation that had exhausted its strength. In the following days, Allied officers inspected the abandoned armor. Major Robert Harrison of the U.S. Salvage Unit noted in his report, all vehicles intact. Fuel required 8,000 gallons, easily supplied from local reserve. What had been an impossible shortage for Peiper was a minor errand for the Allies. 8,000 gallons, a rounding error in their logistical empire. It was then clear to everyone. Germany hadn't lost a battle. It had lost a civilization's capacity to sustain modern war. After the war, even Germany's own generals admitted the truth. Field Marshal Otto von Manschenfeld wrote, "When I learned the Americans burned 8 million gallons rather than let us take it, I knew the war was finished." Historian Richard Overy later calculated that Allied-to-Axis fuel production stood at 50-1. The United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944. Germany barely 33 million. The numbers told the story of inevitability, industrial abundance defeating ideology. In 1984, veterans from both sides met at the La Gleize Museum, standing before Peiper's rusting Tiger tank. An American asked his former enemy, "Why did you stop there?" The German replied quietly, "We ran out of fuel. You burned oceans to keep us from a river." The Battle of the Bulge ended not with surrender, but with realization that courage cannot outlast industry. In that frozen valley, between empty tanks and endless supply lines, the modern age declared its verdict. Wars are not won by valor, but by logistics.